Here is something nobody tells you about the hospital. The building you go to when something is seriously wrong with your body. The place with the white coats and the beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic that hits you the moment you walk through the automatic doors. That building, in the form you recognize it, is roughly 150 years old. 150 years. In the context of human history, that is nothing. That is a blink. That is so recent that your great-great-grandmother might have been born before the modern hospital existed in her city. And yet the question of what people did before hospitals, where they went, who treated them, what happened to them, is one of those questions that almost nobody thinks to ask. Because the hospital feels so permanent, so obviously necessary, so deeply woven into the fabric of how we understand sickness and health, that imagining life without it requires a genuine act of mental effort. So let's make that effort. Let's go back, past the Victorian hospitals with their Nightingale wards and their carbolic acid and their still terrifying surgical theaters, past the medieval pest houses and the monastery infirmaries, all the way back to the beginning of the question, which is also the beginning of a story that is far stranger, far more interesting, and far more human than you might expect. Because the answer to where did sick people go before hospitals turns out not to be nowhere. It turns out to be everywhere. It turns out to be one of the most revealing things you can learn about how any society understood the human body, the nature of illness, the relationship between the living and the dead, and the role of the divine in the daily catastrophe of being mortal. Let's start with the oldest answer. For most of human prehistory, the tens of thousands of years before writing, before cities, before any of the institutions we associate with civilized life, sick people stayed where they were. They stayed in the group. The group took care of them. This sounds simple, it is actually profound. Archaeological evidence from prehistoric sites consistently shows something that surprises researchers when they first encounter it. The presence of individuals who had survived serious injuries or debilitating conditions that would have been fatal without sustained care from other people. A Neanderthal skeleton found at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, dating from roughly 60,000 years ago, shows a man who had lost the use of one arm, was partially blind, and was deaf in one ear, conditions that would have made him essentially unable to provide for himself in a hunter-gatherer environment. He lived, the bone evidence suggests, to what was a fairly advanced age for his time and place. Someone fed him, someone kept him alive when he could not keep himself alive. 60,000 years ago, before language was fully developed, before anything we would recognize as medicine existed, human beings were already caring for their sick and disabled in a way that required deliberate, sustained effort with no immediate practical benefit to the caregivers. We have been hospitals for each other for longer than we have had any other institution. The first time something resembling organized medical care appears in the historical record, it appears not in a building but in a person. The healer. The medicine man, the shaman, the wise woman, the figure in every human community throughout recorded history who held specialized knowledge about illness and its treatment, and to whom the sick were brought. These figures are easy to dismiss from a modern perspective as primitive or superstitious, and that dismissal is a mistake. The shamanic healer of a pre-literate society was not simply performing rituals with no connection to physical reality. They were the repository of accumulated empirical knowledge about which plants reduced fever, which ones drew out infection, which ones managed pain, which ones killed you. They knew things about the human body that had been observed, tested, and passed down across generations through a system of knowledge transmission that, while oral rather than written, was rigorous in its own way. The knowledge was mixed with spiritual interpretation, because spiritual interpretation was the only framework available for understanding why some people got sick and others did not, why some recovered and others died, why illness seemed to strike in patterns that connected to seasons and places and social relationships. But the physical knowledge embedded within the spiritual framework was real. When you went to the shaman, you were going to the most knowledgeable medical practitioner available. The fact that the treatment included ritual alongside herbal medicine did not make the herbal medicine less effective. It just means the shaman was doing two things at once. Now let's jump forward to the first civilizations, because this is where things get genuinely remarkable. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, in the great cities of Babylon and Ur and Nineveh, the understanding of sickness was divided between two different types of practitioner who served complementary functions. The first was the Asu, a physician who treated illness through physical means, herbal preparations, poultices, dietary prescriptions, physical manipulation. The Asu was an empiricist in the sense that their practice was based on observed outcomes. This preparation worked for this condition, that one did not. The second was the Ashipu, an exorcist healer who diagnosed illness in terms of spiritual causation, which demon had entered the patient, which god had been offended, what transgression had brought down divine punishment in the form of sickness, and who treated it through ritual, incantation, and prayer. These were not competing systems, they were complementary ones, and a patient with a serious illness would typically consult both. The Asu dealt with the physical symptoms, the Ashipu dealt with the underlying spiritual cause. From within their own cosmological framework, this made complete logical sense. If illness is caused by spiritual transgression, you need to address both the symptom and the cause. Mesopotamian medical texts preserved on clay tablets that are among the oldest written documents in existence include remarkably detailed descriptions of symptoms and treatments. There are tablets describing what appears to be epilepsy, depression, venereal disease, and various infectious illnesses, along with recommended treatments that mix herbal medicine with ritual in a way that is inseparable. You cannot extract the physical medicine from the spiritual context because they were never understood as separate things. The patient in this system went to the physician's house, or the physician came to the patient's house. There were no dedicated medical buildings in ancient Mesopotamia. Sickness was treated in domestic space, and the idea of a separate building specifically for the treatment of illness had not yet been invented. It was invented, as so many things were, by the ancient Greeks. But not in the form you might expect. The Greeks did not invent the hospital as a practical medical facility. They invented something far more interesting. They invented the healing temple. The cult of Asclepius, the god of medicine, typically depicted with a staff around which a serpent is coiled, an image that survives in modern medical iconography, was one of the most widespread religious movements of the ancient Greek world. There were more than 300 Asclepian healing sanctuaries scattered across Greece, Asia Minor, and eventually the Roman world. People came to these places to be healed, not by physicians, at least not primarily, by the god himself. The central ritual of the Asclepian was called incubation, from the Latin incubare, to lie upon, and it worked like this. You arrived at the sanctuary after a period of preparation, ritual purification, fasting, prayer. You were given treatments to induce a particular state of consciousness, herbal preparations that likely included mildly psychoactive compounds, though the exact substances are debated by scholars. Then you were led into the abaton, the sacred sleeping hall, where you lay down on a stone floor or on the skin of a sacrificed animal and you slept. and in your sleep Asclepius came to you. The god appeared in dreams. Sometimes he touched the diseased part of the body. Sometimes he spoke instructions: take this herb, avoid that food, perform this ritual. Sometimes patients woke to find their symptoms gone. Sometimes they woke with a clear sense of what they needed to do to recover. This sounds like mysticism, and it is mysticism. But it is also, depending on how you look at it, one of the earliest documented uses of what we might now call therapeutic suggestion, or in the more extreme cases, something in the neighborhood of psychosomatic healing. The power of deep belief in recovery, combined with whatever compounds were being administered to induce the dream state, combined with the genuine rest and nourishment that the sanctuary provided, produced real outcomes for real people. We know this because patients left accounts. The sanctuary at Epidaurus preserved inscribed stone tablets describing cures that the god had performed. A man paralyzed for years who woke able to walk. A woman who had been trying to conceive for 5 years who dreamed of the god and became pregnant within the year. A man with a visible tumor on his neck who dreamed that the god cut it out and woke to find it gone. Some of these accounts are clearly mythologized or exaggerated. Others describe outcomes that, while framed in supernatural terms, are not inconsistent with what spontaneous remission, placebo effects, or the misdiagnosis of psychosomatic conditions might produce. Others remain genuinely inexplicable. The Asclepion was also, alongside its sacred function, a genuine center of medical knowledge. Hippocrates, the physician whose name survives in the Hippocratic oath that doctors still take, came from a family with hereditary connections to Asclepius worship. The great medical school at Kos from which the Hippocratic tradition emerged was connected to an Asclepion. The observation of patients over time, the recording of symptoms and outcomes, the building of empirical medical knowledge, all of this happened in the context of the healing sanctuary, not in spite of the religious framework but within it. The sick went to the temple, and at the temple they sometimes got better for reasons that were sometimes divine, sometimes medical, and often impossible to separate. Now let's talk about Rome, because Rome did something with organized healthcare that was genuinely revolutionary and almost nobody talks about it. The Romans invented the hospital, or something so close to it that the difference is technical rather than substantial. They called it the valetudinarium, and the first ones were not built for civilians, they were built for soldiers. The Roman army, which was at its height a force of roughly 300,000 men spread across an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, understood something that no previous military organization had grasped clearly enough to act on. An army that can return injured soldiers to fighting fitness faster than its enemies is an army with a structural advantage. Medical care was not charity, it was military strategy. Valetudinaria have been found by archaeologists at dozens of Roman fort sites across the former empire. They follow a strikingly consistent design, a rectangular building arranged around a central courtyard, with rows of small individual rooms opening off a central corridor, each room large enough for 1 or 2 patients. There were separate rooms for different types of cases. There was a dedicated space for the medical staff. There is evidence in some excavated examples of drainage systems and water supply that suggest a level of attention to sanitation that was well ahead of what most Roman civilians enjoyed. The Roman army employed medical officers, medici, as a permanent part of its structure. These were trained practitioners, not simply experienced soldiers who happened to know some first aid. They performed surgery, treated wounds and infections, managed the chronic conditions that came with the brutal physical demands of military life. At the larger legionary fortresses, the medical staff and facilities were substantial by any pre-modern standard. The valetudinarium was a hospital in every meaningful sense of the word. It was a dedicated building for the treatment of illness and injury, staffed by trained practitioners, organized around the needs of the patient rather than around any other function. But it was only for soldiers. Civilian Romans with money and status were treated at home, by physicians who came to them. The physician in Roman society was a complex figure, respected for their knowledge, sometimes extremely highly paid, but also socially ambiguous in a culture that associated manual work with lower status. Many Roman physicians were Greek freedmen or slaves, which colored how their profession was perceived regardless of their individual skill. The very wealthy had household physicians, essentially private doctors on retainer. The moderately wealthy could afford to consult a physician when needed. The poor were treated by whoever would treat them, neighborhood healers, midwives, the local representative of whatever healing cult was popular in their area. And then Rome fell, and the valetudinarium fell with it, and the next institution that looked anything like organized healthcare for civilians would not appear for several hundred years, and when it did appear, it would come from a completely unexpected direction. It would come from Christianity. This is one of the most important and least appreciated facts about the history of medicine. The hospital, as a place that treated civilians regardless of their ability to pay, was invented by the Christian Church, not as a medical institution in the first instance, as an act of theological conviction. The earliest Christian communities had a practice of caring for the sick and the poor that was explicitly theological in its motivation. The sick were to be cared for because caring for the sick was caring for Christ. "I was sick and you visited me," says the figure in Matthew's Gospel who represents all those in need. This was not a metaphor or a general principle. It was understood as a literal claim. The sick person in front of you was Christ in front of you, and your response to one was your response to the other. The first dedicated Christian institutions for the care of the sick appeared in the 4th century, following the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, which ended the persecution of Christians and allowed the church to own property and build buildings. Bishop Basil of Caesarea, a city in what is now Turkey, established what is often cited as the first true hospital in the Christian tradition around 370 CE. It was a complex of buildings that included separate sections for different categories of need: the sick, the poor, travelers, lepers. The leper house deserves particular attention because leprosy, or what was called leprosy, since the medieval diagnosis probably covered several distinct conditions, occupied a unique place in the medieval understanding of illness. And the way society dealt with leprosy tells you something profound about how medicine and morality were intertwined in the medieval mind. Leprosy was understood as simultaneously a physical and a spiritual condition. The visible deformity of advanced leprosy, the loss of fingers and toes, the facial changes, the characteristic skin lesions, was interpreted as an outward sign of inner spiritual corruption, a mark placed by God on those whose sins had become physically manifest. This interpretation made lepers dangerous in a double sense. They were physically contagious and spiritually contaminating. And yet, and this is the paradox at the heart of medieval attitudes toward illness, they were also understood as specially connected to God through their suffering. The leper who endured their condition with patience was imitating Christ's passion. Some medieval theologians argued that lepers were purging their sins on earth and would thus pass through purgatory more quickly. Caring for lepers was not just charity, it was a route to spiritual merit. So medieval society simultaneously expelled lepers from towns, requiring them to ring bells to warn of their approach, to wear identifying clothing, to stay outside the city gates, and built elaborate institutions for their care, staffed by religious who considered tending the leper the most spiritually significant work they could do. Saint Francis of Assisi, one of the most important figures in medieval Christianity, described his encounter with a leper, overcoming his natural revulsion to embrace the man as the moment of his spiritual transformation. Caring for lepers was, for Francis, not a sacrifice, it was a gift. This paradox, the leper as both outcast and sacred, is one of the places where medieval medicine and medieval theology are most completely inseparable, and it helps explain why the medieval hospital was such a strange institution by modern standards. The medieval hospital was not primarily a medical institution, it was a spiritual one. The great hospitals of medieval Europe, the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in 651 CE and still operating today as one of the oldest continuously functioning hospitals in the world, the Santo Spirito in Rome, the various English foundations of the same period, were all religious institutions first and medical institutions second. They were staffed by religious orders whose primary obligation was the spiritual care of the patients. Prayer, sacraments, the rites of the dying, these were as central to the hospital's function as any physical treatment. When you entered a medieval hospital as a patient, your first encounter was not with a physician, it was with a priest. Your soul was more immediately important than your body because your soul was eternal and your body was temporary, and if you were going to die in this hospital, which was a real possibility, since many people admitted were already seriously ill, dying in a state of spiritual grace was the priority. The beds in medieval hospitals were often arranged so that every patient had a direct line of sight to the altar. The rhythm of the hospital day was the rhythm of the liturgical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The sick were woken for the night office. They prayed with the religious. They were part of the community of prayer in a way that had no separation between spiritual and physical healing, because in the medieval understanding there was no such separation. Physical treatment was also provided. The herbalist knowledge accumulated over centuries in monastery gardens was real and effective for many conditions. Wound care, bone setting, birthing assistance, these were practical skills that the religious who staffed hospitals possessed and practiced. But the physical treatment was always in service of the spiritual goal. You went to the medieval hospital to die well. If you happened to recover, that was wonderful and you went home. But the institution was fundamentally organized around preparing people for death rather than preventing it. This is so foreign to the modern understanding of what a hospital is for that it is worth sitting with for a moment. The hospital as a place where you go to not die, where the entire organizational logic is oriented toward keeping you alive, is a modern invention. Or most of the history of the institution, the hospital was a place where you went because you were probably going to die, and the question was not how to prevent your death but how to manage it with appropriate spiritual dignity. Now, here is the turning point. Here is where the story shifts from ancient to modern, and the shift happens through a woman in a war in a part of the world that most people have forgotten was the site of one of the most important transformations in medical history. The Crimean War, fought between 1853 and 1856, was a conflict between Russia on one side and an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia on the other. It is not particularly well remembered today except for two things: the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade and Florence Nightingale. Nightingale arrived at the British military hospital at Scutari near Constantinople in November 1854 with a team of 38 nurses that she had personally recruited. What she found there was not a hospital in any meaningful sense. It was a building in which men were dying. The wounded from the Crimean battlefields arrived at Scutari already exhausted, often with infected wounds, suffering from cholera and dysentery contracted in the field. The hospital building, a converted Ottoman barracks, was enormous, but its size was its only virtue. The sewers beneath it were blocked. The ventilation was non-existent. The wards were so overcrowded that men were lying on the bare floor in their own filth. There was a shortage of everything: bandages, medicines, clean water, food, bedpans, even basic furniture. The mortality rate among patients admitted to Scutari when Nightingale arrived was approximately 42%. Nearly half of everyone admitted was dying. Nightingale attacked this problem with a combination of personal ferocity, political intelligence, and something that was genuinely new in the management of healthcare: data. She counted, she recorded, she analyzed. She produced what became famous as her polar area diagrams, a form of statistical chart that she helped pioneer, showing visually and unmistakably that the majority of deaths at Scutari were from preventable infectious diseases caused by the filthy conditions, not from battle wounds. She used these charts not as academic exercises but as political weapons, presenting them to officials in London who had the power to act, forcing the reorganization of the hospital's sanitation systems. Clean water was brought in, the sewers were cleared, ventilation was improved, food was reorganized. Basic nursing care, the washing of patients, the changing of bedding, the regular monitoring of the sick, was systematized in a way that had never been done before in a military hospital. Within 6 months, the mortality rate at Scutari had dropped from 42% to about 2%. This was not a miracle. It was what happened when you applied basic sanitation to a previously unsanitary institution. But it was also the proof of principle for everything that came after: that the systematic application of cleanliness, order, and observation to the care of the sick produced dramatically better outcomes than whatever had come before. Nightingale returned from the Crimea as the most famous woman in Britain and one of the most influential figures in the world. She spent the next 50 years, she lived to 90, as an extraordinary force in the reorganization of nursing, hospital design, medical statistics, and public health. Her book Notes on Hospitals, published in 1863, established principles of hospital design and management that influenced the construction of hospitals across the Western world for the next generation. The Nightingale Ward, a large open room with beds arranged along both walls, high windows for ventilation, a nursing station at one end, became the standard design for hospital wards across Britain and America in the second half of the 19th century. It was not the most sophisticated possible design. But it was a design based on a clear principle: maximum ventilation, maximum observation, maximum cleanliness, that had been derived from empirical observation of what actually made patients better rather than worse. The modern hospital, the institution you visit today, grew from this moment and the moments immediately surrounding it. Lister's antiseptic surgery in the 1860s, which meant that operations no longer routinely killed patients through infection. The professionalization of nursing, driven by Nightingale and her followers. The development of trained medical education that produced physicians who knew more or less the same things, rather than wildly varying depending on where they had been apprenticed. The germ theory of disease, which finally provided the theoretical framework that made sense of why cleanliness mattered. All of these things came together in the second half of the 19th century to produce something that had never existed before: a place where sick people went and had a reasonable expectation that the experience would make them more rather than less likely to survive. Think about what that meant. For the entirety of human history before roughly 1870, entering a hospital made you statistically more likely to die. The concentration of sick people in an enclosed space, combined with the complete absence of understanding about how infectious disease spread, meant that the hospital as an institution was itself a disease vector. You might go in with a broken leg and come out with cholera. This was not unusual. This was normal. It was why the wealthy refused to go to hospital. They were treated at home, where the disease concentration was lower, and why admission to a hospital in the 18th or early 19th century was considered, with good reason, essentially a death sentence. The reversal of this situation, the transformation of the hospital from a place you went to die into a place you went to survive, is one of the most consequential changes in the history of human life. It happened within the lifetimes of people who remembered when it was otherwise. It happened fast enough that the same physician could have trained in the old world and practiced in the new one. And it happened not through a single great discovery but through the accumulation of many changes, each individually important, combining into something transformative. Today, the average hospital in the developed world has a mortality rate that would have been considered miraculous by any previous generation. People recover from conditions that would have been fatal 100 years ago. Surgeries that were literally impossible 50 years ago are performed routinely. Infections that killed entire wards are controlled with antibiotics. Premature babies who could not have survived outside the womb are kept alive in incubators until they can. All of this is so recent. All of it rests on foundations that were laid in most cases within the last 200 years by people who were working without the benefit of everything that came after them. The healer who sat with the sick elder in a cave 60,000 years ago, the Mesopotamian physician mixing herbs in a clay pot, the Greek pilgrim sleeping on a stone floor waiting for a god to come in their dreams, the medieval monk changing a leper's bandages as an act of prayer, Florence Nightingale standing in a dark ward at Scutari at 2 in the morning, lamp in hand, counting the dying. Every one of them was the hospital that existed before the hospital existed. Every one of them was the answer to the question you started this with. Where did sick people go before hospitals? They went to whoever would come to them. They went to whoever had the knowledge and the willingness to stay. They went to the temple, to the healer, to the monastery, to the wise woman at the edge of the village, to the family member who did not leave the bedside. They went, in other words, to the same place the sick have always gone when medicine has nothing else to offer. They went to the person who would not leave them alone in the dark. That, more than any building or any institution, is what a hospital has always really been. The building is new. The impulse to stay is as old as we are.